In the autumn of 2001, when America was still reeling from the smoke and ash of September 11th, another darkness arrived. It came not from the sky, but through something far more intimate, something we touched every day: our mail. Between mid-September and early October of that year, letters containing weaponized anthrax spores moved silently through the postal system, finding their way to newsrooms, offices, and the desks of United States senators. 5 people would lose their lives. 17 more would become infected. 32,000 Americans would face the terrifying possibility that they had been exposed to a biological weapon. And what followed was one of the most sprawling, costly, and ultimately controversial investigations in the history of American law enforcement. This is a true story, a story of terror, science, obsession, and questions that remain unanswered more than 2 decades later. Tonight, we open the file on Amerithrax, the case of the anthrax attacks. And I need to warn you, what we're about to explore isn't just a mystery. It's a mirror held up to our vulnerabilities, our assumptions, and the fragile line between justice and certainty. If cases like this compel you to seek truth in the darkness, then subscribe to this channel. Because the files we open here don't offer easy answers. They offer something more valuable. They offer questions worth asking. Let's begin. Part 1. The letters. It was September 18th, 2001, just 7 days after the Twin Towers fell. America was a nation transformed overnight, walking through a new landscape of fear and suspicion. The skyline had changed, the sense of safety had vanished, and into this already fractured moment, someone sent letters, 4 of them in that first wave, mailed from a postal box in Trenton, New Jersey. Each envelope contained a simple handwritten note. The words were crude, deliberate, chilling. "This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great." And beneath those words, folded inside each envelope, was a fine, tan-colored powder. Anthrax spores. Not just any anthrax. Weaponized. Refined. Engineered to float through the air, to slip through the smallest cracks, to find the lungs of anyone unlucky enough to breathe it in. The first letters arrived at news organizations: NBC News, the New York Post, the offices of American Media Incorporated in Boca Raton, Florida, a tabloid publisher known for the National Enquirer. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. The powder seemed harmless. Some thought it was a prank, a tasteless hoax exploiting the nation's trauma. But it wasn't a hoax. On October 2nd, a photo editor named Robert Stevens walked into a hospital in Florida. He was 63 years old, a quiet man who worked with images, not words, who spent his days cropping photographs and designing layouts. He complained of fever, confusion, nausea. The doctors initially suspected meningitis, but when they performed a spinal tap, they found something else: Bacillus anthracis, anthrax bacteria, the first case in the United States in 25 years. Robert Stevens passed away on October 5, 2001, 4 days after being admitted. The first victim of an attack that most Americans didn't yet know was happening. And in those early October days, panic began to spread. Not the loud, explosive panic of a bombing, but something quieter, more insidious, the kind that makes you afraid to open your mail, to touch a doorknob, to breathe the air in a crowded room. Then came the second wave. 3 weeks after the first letters were mailed, on October 9th, 2 more envelopes entered the postal system, also postmarked from Trenton. But these letters were different, more potent, more refined. They were addressed to 2 Democratic senators, Tom Daschle of South Dakota, the Senate Majority Leader, and Patrick Leahy of Vermont. The letter to Senator Daschle was opened by a staffer on October 15th in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington. When the envelope was torn open, a puff of white powder escaped into the air. The room was immediately sealed. Hazmat teams arrived, tests were run, and the results confirmed what everyone feared: high-grade anthrax, extremely pure, extraordinarily dangerous. The Daschle letter alone contained enough weaponized anthrax to potentially infect thousands of people. This wasn't amateur hour. This was sophisticated. Someone with knowledge, with access, with intent. By late October, the death toll was rising. Thomas Morris Jr., 55 years old, a postal worker at the Brentwood Mail Processing and Distribution Center in Washington. He handled the mail that passed through that facility, mail that included the letters addressed to senators. He felt ill on October 19th. By October 21st, he was gone. The next day, Joseph Curseen Jr., 47, also a Brentwood postal worker, also passed. Two men who went to work, sorted mail, did their jobs, and paid for it with their lives. The Brentwood facility would later be renamed in their honor. The Curseen Morris Processing and Distribution Center, a memorial in the form of an address. But the terror didn't stop there. On October 31st, a 61-year-old hospital worker in New York City named Kathy Nguyen lost her life. She was a Vietnamese immigrant, a woman who had survived war and displacement, who had come to America seeking safety. And she died from anthrax exposure. The FBI searched her apartment, her workplace. They found nothing. No spores, no letters, no explanation. She had somehow encountered what investigators would later describe as a faceful of anthrax, enough to fill her lungs and take her life, but they never discovered where or how. And then, on November 21st, Ottilie Lundgren, 94 years old, a widow in Oxford, Connecticut, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and nearly a century of American history. She rarely left her home. She had no connection to the media, to politics, to government, and yet the anthrax found her. It crossed state lines, passed through sorting facilities, somehow reached her mailbox, and ended her life. 5 people, 5 lives, each one snuffed out by an invisible enemy that traveled through one of the most mundane, trusted systems in American life. The Postal Service. If this story is gripping you, if you feel the weight of these lives lost, then I ask you to do something for me. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling, because these aren't just statistics. These were real people, and their stories deserve to be heard. Part 2. The investigation begins. The FBI moved quickly. By early October, they had established what they called the Amerithrax task force. It would become one of the largest investigations in the Bureau's history. More than 600,000 investigator work hours would be logged. Thousands of witnesses interviewed across 6 continents. Evidence collected, analyzed, debated, and reanalyzed. The cost would exceed $100 million. And it would take 7 years. 7 years to reach a conclusion. A conclusion that even today remains deeply disputed. In those early days, the investigation was chaotic. Leads poured in from every direction. Tips, theories, suspects. The letters themselves offered clues. The handwriting. The misspelling of penicillin as penacillin. The references to Allah, designed to mimic Islamic extremism. But investigators quickly realized something crucial. Whoever sent these letters wanted people to think this was the work of foreign terrorists, that it was connected to September 11th, that it was Al-Qaeda, or some offshoot, continuing the assault on America. But the science told a different story. The anthrax in those letters was the Ames strain, a strain originally isolated from a diseased cow in Texas in 1981. It wasn't a strain found naturally in the Middle East. It was American. Specifically, it was a strain used in U.S. biodefense research. Suddenly, the investigation shifted. This wasn't foreign terror. This was domestic. This was someone inside the system, someone with access to one of the most secure, restricted biological agents in the world, someone who worked in a laboratory, who knew how to weaponize anthrax, who understood the science of death. The FBI began compiling a list. Every lab in America with the Ames strain, every researcher, scientist, and technician with access. They narrowed it down. Fort Detrick, Maryland, the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. Samrid, one of the most advanced biodefense facilities in the nation, and they began looking at the people who worked there. Part 3. The first suspect. His name was Stephen Hatfill, 48 years old, a physician, a biological weapons expert, a man with an interesting, almost cinematic background. He had worked in biodefense, he had connections to government programs, he had a history that included work in Africa, where he had dealt with infectious diseases, and he had written about bioterrorism scenarios, publicly, in detail. In the summer of 2002, the FBI named him a person of interest, not a suspect, not officially, but the distinction barely mattered. His life was dismantled. The FBI raided his apartment, multiple times. They tapped his phones. They followed him everywhere, literally. Agents tailed him in cars, on foot, through grocery stores and parking lots. They wanted him to know he was being watched. The pressure was intentional, intense, unrelenting. Hatfield maintained his innocence. He held press conferences, his voice shaking with anger and desperation. He said he had nothing to do with the attacks, that he was being destroyed for something he didn't do, that the FBI was ruining his reputation, his career, his life. And for more than 2 years, the scrutiny continued. The media coverage was relentless. His name became synonymous with the Anthrax attacks. In the public mind, he was guilty, but the FBI couldn't prove it. There was no physical evidence linking him to the letters. No anthrax in his home, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing. By 2008, the government quietly settled. They paid Stephen Hatfield $5.8 million, an annuity of $4.6 million, plus additional compensation. They exonerated him. Officially, the Justice Department admitted that the investigation into Hatfield had violated his rights, that he had been wrongly targeted, that he was innocent. And just like that, the first chapter of Amerithrax closed, not with justice, but with a payout, and an apology, and a man whose life had been shattered by suspicion. If you're feeling the injustice of this, if Hatfield's story troubles you, then do me a favor. Share this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, because stories like this matter. They reveal the cost of getting it wrong. Part 4. The second suspect. In late 2006, the investigation pivoted. New leadership at the FBI, a fresh look at the evidence, and a new focus, this time on a man named Bruce Ivins. Dr. Bruce Edwards Ivins. Age 51 at the time the investigation zeroed in on him, a senior biodefense researcher at Fort Detrick, a microbiologist who had worked at USAMRIID for 18 years, one of the nation's top anthrax experts, a man who had spent nearly 2 decades studying Bacillus anthracis, how it grows, how it spreads, how it can be weaponized. He was, by all accounts, one of the foremost authorities in his field. To his colleagues, Ivins was a contradiction. Some described him as outgoing, friendly, with a quirky sense of humor. He played the keyboard in a church band. He juggled. Yes, juggled. He was known to entertain at office parties, performing little tricks and jokes. But others saw something different, something harder to define, awkwardness, social discomfort, a man who didn't quite fit in, who seemed to carry something heavy beneath the surface. What most of them didn't know was that Bruce Ivins had been struggling for years, decades really, with mental health issues, depression, anxiety, paranoia. He had been prescribed antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti-anxiety medications. He attended group therapy sessions, and in those sessions, according to later reports, he spoke about anger, about resentment, about feeling undervalued, overlooked, dismissed. He made statements that troubled the therapists who worked with him, statements about violence, about revenge. But there was something else, something stranger, more disturbing, an obsession, not with anthrax, not with bioweapons, but with a sorority, Kappa Kappa Gamma. It started in the 1970s, when Ivins was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He met a woman there, a classmate named Nancy Hagewood. She was a member of Kappa Kappa Gamma, and for reasons that Ivins himself could never fully articulate, he became fixated on the sorority. Not on Hagewood necessarily, but on the organization itself, the symbols, the rituals, the secrecy. He told Hagewood once openly that it wasn't just an interest, it was an obsession. Years later, in 1982, Nancy Hagewood discovered that someone had vandalized her property, her car, her fence, her sidewalk. Spray painted in red were the Greek letters of Kappa Kappa Gamma, KKG. She reported it to the police, but the case went nowhere. She never knew who did it. Not until decades later, when FBI investigators confronted Bruce Ivins with the evidence, and he admitted it. He had done it. He had also broken into Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority houses, twice, stolen documents, ritual books, information about the organization's secret codes and ceremonies, and he had written a letter to a local newspaper, using Nancy Hagewood's name, trying to manipulate the narrative around the sorority. Why? The FBI believed it traced back to a rejection, that in college, Ivins had asked a Kappa Kappa Gamma member on a date, and she had said no, and that rejection had festered for decades, twisted into something pathological, something that drove him to acts of vandalism, theft, deception. Now, you might be asking yourself, what does any of this have to do with anthrax, with terrorism, with 5 people losing their lives? And that's the question investigators asked too, because the theory that emerged was this: one of the letters, the one sent to the New York Post. It was mailed from a postal box in Trenton, New Jersey, a box located near the office of the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority, near Princeton University, where the organization had a chapter. The FBI theorized that Ivins chose that location deliberately, that the attacks weren't just about anthrax, they were about his obsession, about sending a message, about inserting himself, however subtly, into the narrative of the sorority he couldn't let go of. It's a theory, and like so much of this case, it's contested, but it's what the FBI believed. Part 5. The case against Ivins. By 2008, the FBI had built what they considered a compelling case, not ironclad, not conclusive, but enough, they believed, to indict Bruce Ivins on 5 counts of capital charges. Charges that carried the possibility of a death sentence. Let me walk you through what they found, what they claimed, and what, even today, remains deeply controversial. First, the genetic evidence. The anthrax in the attack letters was tested. Rigorously. Investigators identified 4 specific genetic mutations in the spores. Mutations that acted like a fingerprint, a unique signature. And the FBI traced those mutations back to a single flask of anthrax, a flask labeled RMR-1029. That flask was housed at Fort Detrick, in Bruce Ivins' laboratory. And according to the FBI, Ivins was the only person who had created that particular batch. He maintained it. He controlled access to it. Prosecutors stated, unequivocally, that the anthrax in the letters came from that flask, and that Ivins was the sole custodian. But here's where it gets complicated. That flask wasn't locked away in a vault. It wasn't guarded 24/7. Other scientists had access to the lab, to the materials. In fact, investigators later confirmed that at least 419 people had some level of access to usamriid and its anthrax stocks. At least 10 scientists worked regularly in the lab, and samples from RMR-1029 had been sent to other facilities, to labs in Ohio, in New Mexico. So while the genetic evidence pointed to Ivins' flask, it didn't necessarily point to Ivins alone. Second, the FBI looked at his behavior, his patterns. In the weeks before the attacks, Ivins made a series of unusual late-night visits to his laboratory. Between September 11th and September 18th, when the first letters were mailed, he was in the lab after hours, alone, working late into the night. His keycard records showed he accessed the lab at odd times, times that didn't align with his normal work schedule. Then between October 1st and October 8th, when the second batch of letters was sent, he did it again. Late nights, alone, with no clear explanation for what he was doing. When questioned, Ivins gave inconsistent answers. He said he was cleaning equipment, checking on samples, doing routine maintenance. But his colleagues found that strange. The work he described didn't require late-night hours. It didn't require solitude. And it didn't explain why, during those specific windows, he suddenly needed to be in the lab when no one else was around. Third, the FBI believed Ivins had tried to mislead them. In the early stages of the investigation, when usamriid scientists were asked to provide samples of their anthrax for comparison, Ivins submitted a sample. But something was wrong. The sample he provided didn't match the protocols. It tested inconsistently. One test came back negative, another came back positive. The FBI suspected he had deliberately submitted a false or contaminated sample to throw them off the trail, to obscure the connection between his flask and the attack letters. Later, in 2002, Ivins drew a hand sketch, a diagram. He presented it to investigators, trying to show that the anthrax in the letters couldn't have come from his lab, that it must have come from a colleague's stock, from a different facility. The FBI characterized this as an attempt to frame someone else, to redirect suspicion away from himself. Fourth, there was the matter of immunization. Prosecutors noted that in early September 2001, just before the first letters were mailed, Ivins vaccinated himself against anthrax. Now, for someone working in an anthrax lab, vaccination isn't unusual. It's recommended, sometimes required. But the timing struck investigators as suspicious. Why that specific moment? Was he preparing himself for exposure? Was he planning something? Fifth, the mental health red flags. By 2007, Ivins was seeing therapists regularly. He was on a cocktail of medications, antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti-anxiety drugs, and according to one therapist, a woman named Jean Dulay, he was volatile, paranoid. He made statements in group therapy about wanting to harm people, about government conspiracies, about feeling persecuted. In July 2008, Julie filed for a restraining order against him. She described him as dangerous, as someone capable of violence, and finally motive. Why would Bruce Ivins do this? Why would a scientist who had dedicated his career to studying and preventing anthrax unleash it on his own country? The FBI's theory was this: the anthrax vaccine program. Ivins had spent years working on vaccine research, trying to develop better, more effective vaccines against anthrax exposure. But by 2001, funding for the program was drying up. Interest was waning. The government was shifting priorities. And Ivins, according to prosecutors, saw the attacks as a way to reignite that interest, to create a crisis that would funnel money and attention back into his life's work. It was self-serving, desperate, twisted, but it gave him, they believed, a reason. Now, before we go further, I want to pause, because this is a lot, a mountain of circumstantial evidence, behavior patterns, lab access, obsession, mental illness, and it paints a picture. But it's not a photograph, it's a sketch, and there are pieces missing, pieces that to this day have never been filled in. If you're still with me, if this case is pulling you in the way it pulled me in, then hit that like button. Let me know you're here, because we're about to go deeper, into the doubt, into the questions that won't go away. Part 6. The End of Bruce Ivins. In July 2008, Bruce Ivins was taken to a hospital, a forensic evaluation, then transferred to a psychiatric facility in Baltimore, Shepherd Pratt. He stayed there for 2 weeks, receiving treatment, medication adjustments, therapy. On July 24th, he was released, sent home to Frederick, Maryland, to his wife, to his house, to the life that was crumbling around him. By this point, Ivins knew the walls were closing in. He knew the FBI believed he was responsible, that they were preparing to indict him. His lawyer, Paul Kemp, had told him what was coming. 5 counts, capital charges, the possibility of execution, the full weight of the United States government bearing down on one man. On the morning of July 29, 2008, someone called 911. Bruce Ivins was unconscious, unresponsive. Emergency services arrived at his home and found him in medical distress. He had taken an overdose, a massive dose of acetaminophen mixed with codeine, prescription Tylenol, enough to overwhelm his liver, shut down his organs, end his life. He was rushed to Frederick Memorial Hospital, but it was too late. Bruce Ivins passed away that day. He was 62 years old. His attorney released a statement. It was pointed, angry, defiant. Kemp said, "We assert his innocence in these matters," and would have established that at trial. The relentless pressure of accusation and innuendo takes its toll in different ways on different people. In Dr. Ivins' case, it led to his untimely death. And just like that, the suspect was gone. No trial, no testimony, no cross-examination, No opportunity for Ivins to defend himself. No opportunity for prosecutors to present their evidence in a courtroom. The case that had consumed 7 years, hundreds of investigators, and over $100 million ended not with a verdict, but with a body. The FBI formally closed the Amerithrax investigation on February 19, 2010. They released a 92-page summary of their findings. They declared unequivocally that Bruce Ivins was the sole perpetrator of the Anthrax attacks, that he acted alone, that he mailed the letters, that he was responsible for 5 deaths and 17 infections. Case closed. But was it? Part 7. The Doubt. In 2009, the FBI did something unusual. They commissioned an independent review. They asked the National Academy of Sciences to examine the scientific evidence in the case, to validate the genetic analysis, to confirm that the conclusions drawn from the lab work were sound. It was meant to be a stamp of approval, a way to silence the critics, to put the controversy to rest. The panel worked for 2 years. Scientists, microbiologists, genetics experts. They reviewed the FBI's data, the testing protocols, the analysis of the anthrax spores, and in 2011 they released their report. It was not the endorsement the FBI had hoped for. It was a critique, a dissection, a rejection of certainty. The panel concluded that the genetic evidence did not definitively demonstrate that the anthrax in the letters came from Bruce Ivins' flask. It was consistent with the flask. It supported an association. But it didn't prove it. The mutations identified in the attack spores were unique, yes, but they didn't rule out other sources, other labs, other batches that might have shared those mutations through parallel evolution or sample sharing. The panel noted that the FBI had overstated the strength of the genetic analysis, that they had failed to rigorously explore alternative explanations, that the science, while sophisticated, wasn't as conclusive as the government had claimed. Dr. David Relman, a bioterrorism expert at Stanford and vice chair of the review committee, put it plainly. It is not possible to reach a definitive conclusion about the origins of the anthrax in the mailings based on the available scientific evidence alone. The panel also disputed the FBI's claim that Ivins had the unique skill set required to weaponize the anthrax. They noted that the methods used to prepare the spores were uncertain, that multiple scientists across multiple facilities, he could have possessed the knowledge and capability, that Ivins wasn't the only one, and there was more. In 2014, the Government Accountability Office, Congress's watchdog agency, released its own report. They found that the FBI's investigation was marred by weak scientific practices and analytical gaps, that contractors hired to test the spores relied on poorly designed sampling and statistical methods, that critical research hadn't been conducted, that conclusions had been drawn without sufficient foundation. Members of Congress began asking questions. Senator Patrick Leahy, who had received one of the anthrax letters, expressed doubt. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, called for hearings. He pointed out contradictions in the government's own arguments, noted that Justice Department civil attorneys had initially argued that Ivins lacked access to the specialized equipment needed to produce weaponized anthrax, then under pressure changed their position. Representative Rush Holt of New Jersey, a physicist, stated that the FBI had placed too much certainty on the scientific elements of the case. He called for a national commission, an independent investigation, something like the 9/11 Commission, a full accounting of what happened and what didn't. Experts outside the government weighed in. Merrill Nass, a biological warfare specialist, said it plainly. Microbial forensics can link anthrax to a strain and a lab, but they cannot link it to an individual. The evidence pointed to a place, not a person. In 2011, 3 scientists published findings in the Journal of Bioterrorism and Biodefense. They had studied the chemical signatures in the attack anthrax, and they found something unexpected. Tin, a metallic element that shouldn't have been there. The presence of tin suggested a level of sophistication in the manufacturing process, a level that contradicted the FBI's narrative that the anthrax was crudely prepared. The FBI searched for years, trying to find tin in microbiological lab supplies at Fort Detrick. They found none. So where did it come from? No one knows. Colleagues of Ivins came forward. They said it would have been impossible for him to produce the quantity of anthrax powder found in the letters without being noticed, that the process required specialized equipment, ventilation, safety protocols, that he couldn't have done it alone in secret in the middle of the night. And there were the unresolved mysteries. The letter that presumably contained the anthrax that ended Robert Stevens' life in Florida was never found. Kathy Nguyyen's source of exposure in New York was never identified. In 2007, 6 years after the attacks, the FBI searched Ivins' home and vehicles extensively. They found no anthrax spores, not a trace. If he had produced large quantities of weaponized powder, where was it? How did he clean up so thoroughly that not a single spore remained? The case against Bruce Ivins was circumstantial, built on patterns, behaviors, and associations. But no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses. No one ever saw him mail the letters. No one saw him prepare the spores. And no one could provide a clear, undeniable motive that made sense. Part 8. The Alternative Theories. As doubt grew, so did alternative theories. Some believed the investigation had missed the real perpetrator entirely, that the focus on Ivins was a way to close an embarrassing, expensive case that the FBI couldn't solve. Others pointed to the international angle. The National Academy of Sciences report revealed that the FBI had conducted sample collection missions overseas, that they had investigated possible connections to foreign groups attempting to develop anthrax programs. Samples from one overseas site, allegedly associated with a group's bioweapons efforts, tested positive for Ames strain DNA using certain analysis methods. But the samples wouldn't grow culturable spores. The details were classified. The full story was never released. Some wondered if there had been a conspiracy, multiple perpetrators, a coordinated effort. Others believed that Ivins had been framed, that someone had used his flask, his access, his lab to carry out the attacks and leave him holding the blame. And still others believed that the real story was buried in classified documents, in intelligence files that would never see the light of day, that the truth, whatever it was, had been deemed too dangerous, too sensitive to reveal. The financial toll of the attacks was staggering. Decontamination efforts cost $320 million. Over 30,000 people required extended antibiotic treatment as a precaution. 21 postal facilities were contaminated. The Brentwood Processing Center in Washington and the Hamilton Distribution Center in Trenton were closed for years. The postal system, one of the most mundane, reliable infrastructures of American life, became a vector of terror. And in the aftermath, settlements were paid. Stephen Hatfill received $5.8 million for being wrongly targeted. The widow of Robert Stevens received $2.5 million with no admission of liability. The government, in effect, acknowledged that mistakes had been made, that certainty was elusive, that justice in this case was incomplete. Part 9. Reflection. So here we are, more than 2 decades removed from the autumn of 2001, from the letters that arrived in newsrooms and Senate offices, from the powder that ended 5 lives and shattered the sense of safety in a nation already traumatized. And what do we know? What can we say with confidence? We know that someone sent those letters. That someone weaponized anthrax and mailed it through the postal system. We know that the anthrax came from an American lab, likely Fort Detrick. We know that the genetic signature matched a flask maintained by Bruce Ivins. We know that Ivins had access, opportunity, and troubling behavioral patterns. We know that he struggled with mental health issues, that he harbored obsessions, that he took his own life before facing trial. But we also know this: the science wasn't definitive, the evidence was circumstantial, the investigation was flawed, the conclusions were disputed by independent experts, by members of Congress, by scientists who examined the data. And Bruce Ivins never had his day in court. He never testified. He never defended himself. He never faced cross-examination. The case against him was presented posthumously in press releases and government summaries, not in a courtroom, not before a jury. And so the question remains: was Bruce Ivins the sole perpetrator of the anthrax attacks? Or was he a troubled man, caught in the machinery of an investigation that needed a resolution. Was justice served, or was a case simply closed? The bioweapons used in those attacks reminded us of something fundamental, that terror doesn't always arrive with explosions and fire. Sometimes it comes quietly, through the mail, through the systems we trust, through the ordinary channels of daily life. And that anonymity, that ability to strike from the shadows, makes it almost impossible to defend against, almost impossible to solve. 20 years later, investigative journalists continue to dig. ProPublica, PBS Frontline, McClatchy newspapers have all published in-depth reports finding new evidence, new inconsistencies, new reasons to doubt the official narrative. The story isn't finished. The file isn't closed, not really, because doubt lingers, and in cases like this, doubt is corrosive. It eats away at trust, at the institutions we rely on, at the certainty we crave. What haunts me, what keeps me coming back to this case, is the reminder that some files don't close cleanly. Some stories don't end with justice. Some truths remain buried, whether by design or by the sheer complexity of the world we inhabit. And sometimes the most unsettling answer is that we may never know, that the real perpetrator might still be out there, or that the system, in its desperation to find resolution, settled on a narrative that fit well enough, but not perfectly, never perfectly. If this case has stayed with you, if it's raised questions you can't shake, then I ask you one more time. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, leave a comment telling me what you think. Because these stories matter, not just as puzzles to solve, but as reflections of who we are, how we seek justice, how we fail, how we try again. The Anthrax attacks of 2001 took 5 lives, but they left behind something more, a wound that never fully healed, a mystery that never fully resolved, and a reminder that in the search for truth, certainty is a luxury we don't always get. This has been The Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and until the next case, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, some files are meant to stay open, because the questions they ask are more important than the answers they never give. Good night.